Welcome to Shenanigans Ensue with
Mary SanGiovanni!
Hi folks, welcome to Cosmic Shenanigans. I'm Mary SanGiovanni, and once again, I'm up to shenanigans of cosmic proportions. This episode, again, is going to be a little bit short. I'm recording it prior to the Scares That Care telethon, which I mentioned last week, so it's going to be a little bit short, but I hope that you will enjoy it. Today, we're going to talk about Peter Straub's A Dark Matter. As this was recently the topic of the book club for the horror show with Brian Keene, Dave Thomas has kindly cut an excerpt from my thoughts and feelings on the novel, why I think it's a great contribution to both cosmic and quiet horror, and my thoughts on quiet horror and what I feel that this book contributes to in terms of cosmic horror. So, here's the clip. I am a big fan of Peter's. He's probably one of the few people that I was actually nervous to meet in person.
Oh, hell yes.
I mean, I was like, I went up to him, I was like, hi, Mr. Straub, I just wanted to meet you. And he's like, you could call me Peter. I was like, he said I could call him Peter. You know, it was like that level of fangirlishness. I do think this is a different style of his, but it's one of the things I wanted to talk about. And I think I'll save it maybe till when we get to the end, is that I think a lot of people have a misconception about quiet horror not being visceral. And by virtue of you know, it being called quiet horror, I can see why. But we're going to come back to why that maybe isn't always 100% accurate.
Oh, yeah. Charlie Grant, T.M. Wright. I can think of...
There's a number of people who write quiet horror where it's just the way it's presented is maybe a little bit different, but there's some brutality in, and like for example, well, let's start with the fact that this is definitely a cosmic horror novel, okay? Because that's my thing, you know. On Cosmic Shenanigans, that's one of the things that I like to do is try to relate the elements of the thing we're talking about in terms of why it can be classified as a cosmic horror, you know, piece of work. Well, we've got the whole, you know, one guy dies, one guy goes insane. We've got this, it's told in flashbacks, which is also a very cosmic horror-y, Lovecraftian kind of thing, where a lot of it is told in flashbacks. And I suspect that might be why he chose to do it that way. The interesting thing, though, with A Dark Matter is that it's not straightforward flashbacks. It's not past, present, past, present, past, present, kind of like it, you know, it's more like past, current, present, past, recent past, further in the past, you know, so it jumps around a lot in terms of time, but it is told in flashbacks, and I think that's an element of cosmic horror. There's, of course, the arcane and occult knowledge.
Right.
We have other dimensional beings, which delight me. And we're going to come back to those too.
It doesn't take much, Dave.
It doesn't take much.
For our anniversary, I give her some otherworldly, other dimensional beings.
And I'm delighted. I'm delighted. And there's a cult.
Honey, I got you a shot.
Yeah, I got you. I got you an interdimensional flower. Oh, this is why I love you. And we have cult. We have cults. Now, one person had asked me about, and recently in talking about things in Cosmic Shenanigans, about whether or not cults and the occult had to be present in a cosmic horror novel. And I had mentioned that a lot of times cults don't have to, but the occult always does. Mm-hmm. And there is a difference for folks, you know, between the occult and a cult. Okay. What I like about this is another thing I'm always harping on the podcast, is that cosmic horror doesn't have to be stilted and antiquated. And I mean, it does lend itself to a certain, I don't know, literary atmosphere. But I think that these occasions where authors sort of update the tropes, for lack of a better word, I find that fascinating. Like Peter's book here, he has a cult, which is so... It seemed to me that in California, cults were very prevalent in the late 60s. There was a lot of people sort of looking for answers, looking for a sense of self, looking for people to accept and love them and a place to belong. And that allowed a lot of predatory people to form these groups of like diehard, blindly loyal followers. And that's kind of what Spencer Mallon comes across to me as. He's one of those 60s cult gurus offering enlightenment while essentially encroaching on the rights of others and justifying it with his philosophies. Like this everything is everything idea is this idea that you can kind of take what you want because nothing belongs to anybody. And that's fine, except when it comes to people taking things from him, like his girlfriend or something. And there's a quote that I think pretty much sums it up perfectly. Peter writes that Mallon, quote, seemed to have a semi-religious feeling about violence, which he saw as a kind of birth. Although he implied that his final goal, attainable through a certain occult ceremony, involved using a sacred violence as a means of so transforming our Earth that the war in Vietnam would end itself. After all this destruction would come a rebirth, the dimensions and nature of which were to be explored joyfully by Mallon and his chosen few. Well, that's the kind of concept that has, ingrained itself in cosmic horror everywhere from like Silent Hill to, Call of Cthulhu and everything in between. There's this idea that religion and violence are intertwined and theoretically for the betterment of society, but it never really works out that way. One of the other things I found interesting was this sort of play on a lot of Lovecraftian stuff has this idea of these ancient books and ancient spells,
right,
and that the verbal speaking of these spells is what causes things to be undone. Like even Robert Bloch, when he was doing the story that precedes Haunter of the Dark. The title escapes me now, but he wrote it for Lovecraft, and it was a prequel to the Haunter of the Dark. And in it, the wizard, who is essentially Lovecraft, accidentally says these words out loud, and this is what causes this being to come from the dimension that it came from. And I find that sort of fascinating that what Peter does is he uses words as a talisman. Like we have this character of Howard Bly, Hootie.
Right.
And
Hootie was my favorite character.
He was mine too. But he uses words, especially big words, as spells, in a sense, that can open and close doors. Like everything that Mallon said to him, all these quotes that were sort of stuck in his head, all of these things that he predicted. And there was a line he said a sentence to each of them about what he thought of them. One of them was the rising tide, and this applied to Dill Olson, like, when the tides rise, you'll be by my side. He called the eel, Lee, he called her his skylark, and said that everybody would, find her beautiful. And in the future, this is what happens. Dill Olson follows him around, and Lee ends up being one of those people that, despite a probably somewhat average appearance, everybody falls in love with her. Everyone thinks she's stunning. She's just one of those personalities that sort of rises up above. And he does this for everybody. And he says, one of you will inhabit the country of the blind. And I think that applies, unless I misread it, I think that applies to both the eel and Hootie.
That's how I took it.
That's
yes.
right. That they're both inhabiting this country of the blind. And because a lot of this book has to do with seeing and not seeing, being there and not being there. But it's fascinating to me that Hootie uses words as a sort of talisman of protection. Like when he ends up in the asylum, at first all he can say are words from that captain's book, the
Hawthorne.
Yeah, I think so. The dictionary of big words, and he doesn't always use them correctly. Because I looked up a couple of those words, and because Peter's a lot smarter than I think a lot of us, and I had to look up a lot of those words, and they're not always in context with what he means, and he knows it. Hootie knows that sometimes he uses the wrong word when he gets flustered,
right.
But it's his only means of communication, and as he gets better, instead of reverting to his own speech at first, he reverts to longer sentences. He reverts to sentence quotes instead of just word quotes. And a lot of the sentence quotes are pretty much dead on. You can understand what he's talking about. But that's, there's this idea of doors too that is a frequent theme throughout the whole thing, from Mallon, opening doors, to Hootie having the nightmare about choosing the wrong door, the sort of Lady or the Tiger kind of metaphor that is pervasive through the whole thing, and that essentially what they opened in the meadow for just a few seconds was a kind of door. And again, all of it is done with words. And what I always liked about Peter's stuff in terms of words was, and this is what I admire about a lot of people who write quiet horror, is their turn of phrase. Ramsey Campbell does it. Charlie Grant did it. Peter does it. Like he describes Mallon when he's describing like a physical description. He mentions the handsome shield of his face. I thought that was kind of an interesting way of looking at somebody, that this man is good looking, but that good lookingness, good looks, whatever you would say, because words are apparently not my friend today, but that that it forms a shield, that you're almost so enthralled by the physical appearance, the outward appearance of this man, that he's shielding what he really is underneath. And that is pervasive throughout the book too. A lot of these people, the handsome shields of their outer shell are covering up a lot of dysfunction and baggage, and sometimes flat out evil, underneath. Whereas, then you've got a couple of people like Keith Hayward, and I have to admit, and I'm sorry to Matt for this.
You think I thought of Matt Hayward?
But every time he just called the guy Hayward, I imagine Matt Hayward killing people. Which is just so wrong. But yeah, I mean, it was. But even Keith Hayward's uncle was described as being fairly good looking. That's why he was good with ladies. Right. Was that he had that handsome shield of a face, more or less. And then probably the other thing that struck me, and the thing that I guess I kind of wanted to focus on, if you don't mind me continuing to
right
babble
on. This is like an episode, a bonus episode of Cosmic Shenanigans.
It is, right? Is that I think that, like we said in the beginning, there is a lot of violence and a lot of gore in quiet horror. I mean, if you look at this book, we've got the bloody hand removal. We've got the idea of tearing people to rags. I mean, I think he mentions that Tilly Hayward, the serial killer, Keith Hayward's uncle,
right,
would keep these women for a long period of time and mutilate them over time, which to me is I mean, not just as a woman, but as a person, like that. There's something horrible about prolonged torture, but especially prolonged disfigurement and torture. I think for women who, so much of their self-esteem is tied up in how they look, that the idea that this guy would systematically destroy everything outwardly beautiful about a person before murdering them and giving them nothing, I think that there's something more horrible about that than if he sat there and described it bit by bit. Like, I would venture to say something even like The Exorcist 3 is quiet horror, because a lot of quiet horror just sort of drops this horrific thing on you, right? And then instead of letting you dwell about it, or instead of letting you process it really through this long description of the gore, it's almost like essentially that your brain, there's a door that's unlocked, and maybe a door that's open, and you're dwelling on it long after the author's moved on to something else.
Well, to use your analogy, if I can interrupt for a second, it's the difference between the infamous scene in Exorcist 3, the hallway shot, with the surgical shears.
Yes.
Versus, we mentioned Dave Scow earlier, who's a friend of Peter's. I'll use David's screenplay for Leatherface, Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3. Both are phenomenal films.
Right.
But both are effective in very different ways.
Yes.
Leatherface shows you
what
happens. Exorcist 3 shows you the shears, shows you the figure, and then moves on with the story. And you're still sitting there fucked up.
Right. Because a lot of times, and this, I think, again, this kind of goes back to what Lovecraft said, that the oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the greatest fear is fear of the unknown. Because what you're not saying or what you're not showing, a lot of times, people will dwell on it. People will imagine things much worse than. I mean, I remember long before we ever started watching Game of Thrones, what I thought the level of violence and rape and torture in that show was far worse than it actually is. Now, granted, they can be graphic sometimes, but what I imagined prior to ever seeing any of it was far worse. So I think we are, and this is not to say that there's not a time and place for the description of gore, but I think that quiet horror has as much of it in there. It's just how they approach it is different. Instead of showing you their opening doors. They're opening doors to let you show yourself, and it is a different reaction. It is a different approach to it, and I think it works differently generationally. And I say that having taught kids, the young end of millennials, I guess, like 19, 20, 21-year-olds, who so much of their news and their video games and their television. And just they're constantly surrounded by visceral violence. You know, cops who like when I was a little kid, I was always told, you know, if you don't feel safe, go find a cop. If you get lost, go find a cop. Now a lot of people are not told to do that because there's sort of a polarizing viewpoints about police officers
in some communities that make them feel unsafe.
Exactly, and. So I think a lot of millennials are constantly surrounded by violence to the point that the showing of it doesn't scare them as much anymore as the suggestion of it, or the suggestion of things worse than physical death or physical pain. They seem to be more frightened by the esoteric, I guess, or the spiritual, the things that. Like because I think that they're little preppers in a way.
Right.
They're little like Walking Dead post-apocalyptic, like we're ready. If something horrible happens, we can protect our bodies, but who's going to protect our souls? And I find that sort of fascinating. I can't say that that's true across the boards, but it's been true in my experience. And I think it's an important thing to acknowledge that, you know, horror is horror. What the only difference between quiet horror and maybe more graphic horror is how that horror is packaged. But if it's good, then the fundamental horror is universal. And I think it's important. The one is not better than the other. It's just a different approach to it.
How the hell do I follow that, Dave?
And that's it for this week. Thanks to Dave Thomas again, my awesome engineer. You can check him out on twitch.tv/meteornotes. Did I do that right? Yeah, woo! You can also check out The Horror Show with Brian Keene, where you can hear me, Dave, and Brian talking about everything related to horror. And you can find both that and Cosmic Shenanigans for free, past episodes, present episodes, future episodes, on Project Entertainment Network, Stitcher, Spotify, Google Play, iTunes, and all other platforms. If you want to advertise on Cosmic Shenanigans, send in an email to Armand Rosamilia at armandrosamilia@gmail.com. And if you donated to Scares That Care this past week to the telethon, we really, really, really appreciate it. Thank you so much. You're doing a lot of good for people who really need the help. So thank you again. I will see you next week. Okay? Thanks for listening. Bye.
Once upon a time, a madman, poet, and thief known as John Urbansick, that's me, challenged myself, to write a story a day, every day for a year, by hand. Some of them worked. Some of them failed. Some of them were spectacular. Then I did it again. Join me every week for Ink Stains as I do it a third time. And I will read you some of these stories. I'll talk about the process, about creativity in general, writing in specific, and maybe I can help ignite your artistic adventures.